Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and welcome to the first of what I'm going to assume will be many miscellaneous video backgrounds. I am currently filming this video in Jakarta, Indonesia. I'm in my cousin's room and today is actually the day that I head to Japan. So before I board that flight and start my new life in Japan, I thought I would reflect on the last 2 months and share with you how I planned for spending 2 months traveling in Europe and in Asia. Those of you that follow me on Instagram will have probably seen my adventures over the last 2 months, but if you do not follow me, which you should, let me quickly recap. So I quit my teaching job and that came to an end in June of this year. I then spent the summer at home spending time with family, and I'm going to say my travels properly began mid-September. So I've been traveling for over 2 months now. Throughout the course of this video I will go into a little bit more detail about where I went and why, but just as a brief overview, I sort of see my travels over the last 2 months split in two. We have the European leg of my adventures and we have the Asian leg. That sounds a bit odd. So throughout this video I'll get into it in a little bit more detail, and I'm also going to share with you my tips and tricks for planning traveling if it's something that you would like to do yourself. Now it goes without saying, this is the first time that I've ever done anything like this. I am a beginner when it comes to the realm of full-time traveling. So take what I say with a pinch of salt. If you have any advice or any recommendations that you would like to add on top of what I'm saying, absolutely leave them down in the comments, because they won't only be useful for myself, but they might be useful for other people who are watching this video. So let's get started. As always, I've made a couple notes on my phone. I will be overlaying different diagrams and pictures as I go, because we all know how much I love a diagram and a picture. So tip number 1 when planning your traveling, I've put down you must identify a start point and an end point. Now if you're planning to travel for a couple months and then come back for a job, your start and end point might just be home. For me, that differed slightly. Throughout the last few months, I had a few different events or dates in the diary that I had to be in a certain location for, so those acted as my sort of start points and end points. Now, unlike most travellers in their 20s, my starting point for my month of travelling around Europe was actually on a cruise. It was my uncle's 50th birthday, and to celebrate, a group of 15 family and friends all booked onto a cruise. So I left to go on this cruise on the 16th of September, and it was a 10-day cruise which left from Rome and went around the Greek islands and then finished again in Rome. So I sort of classed Rome as my start point for my journey, because from that point on all of my family went home and I was staying out in Europe to travel. My end point, or the date that I knew the European leg of my journey had to end, was the 13th of October, because at that point I had to be at an event in San Marino called Rally Legend. So by looking at my calendar, I knew that from the 24th of September to the 13th of October, I had this certain space to play with, and then I could start filling it with an itinerary. My time in San Marino came to an end on the 18th of October, and then I was leaving to head to Bali for the next leg of my adventures on the 21st. So in the last 2 months I only had 3 days at home. That was pretty hectic, but I feel as though I gave myself enough time to sort of unpack, wash, repack and go. So my time in Asia started on the 21st of October, and I was actually booked onto a trip which I will get into more detail in a moment. And my end date for this leg of my journey is actually today. As I'm filming this, it's the 17th of November and I am heading to Japan this evening. So this has been the end date that I've been working towards before the next exciting step in my journey. So those were my sort of start points and end points. I had my family cruise, I had Rally Legend in October, I had a new start point leaving to come to Asia on the 21st of October, and my end point is leaving for Japan right now. I mentioned briefly that my time in Asia started on a tour, and that tour was booked through True Travels and Gals Who Travel. Now if you operate in the same circle of YouTube as I do, I'm sure that you will have heard of the influencer Bronte King. She manages / owns an organisation called Gals Who Graduate, and has since diversified it into multiple different routes, one of which is Gals Who Travel. And at about April time, I think it might have been, I heard through Instagram that Gals Who Travel was collaborating with True Travels on a 10-day tour of Bali. And immediately my ears pricked up. I feel as though Bali is somewhere that I probably would have visited, but it wasn't really too high on my list to travel to myself. But the fact that this trip was organised through an influencer that I trusted, through a tour group that I'd heard lots of good things about, and it would give me the opportunity to meet lots of like-minded gals, it sounded like the perfect mix. So I signed up to the emailing list and eventually booked myself onto this tour, and I cannot recommend it enough. The tour itself was a 10-day tour starting on the 22nd of October, but in order to get to Bali for its starting, I had to leave on the 21st. In paying for this tour, I was paying for my accommodation for 10 nights, I was paying for travel while in Bali, and I was also paying for different activities that we would be doing each day. Now, before booking on, I'd heard a few people do tours like this, but it's never something that I would have actively looked for myself. Having been on one, however, I would highly recommend it. True Travels as a company is just the most fun. The guide that we had during our time in Bali was fantastic. Andre, this is your shout out. I honestly could not recommend it enough. So if you're looking to travel and you're not entirely sure where to start, I would recommend looking for a tour group. For me, coming to Asia for the first time, I would have had no idea what I was doing if I just got off a flight and was left to my own devices. Being on that tour, it gave me a little bit of support. The local guide was there to give us a bit of advice, and it meant that when the 10 days was over and I left the tour group behind, I had that little bit more confidence in travelling by myself throughout Asia. So, you've got your start points and end points, you've looked into some possible tours that you might want to do. My next tip is then to try and find a sensible route. Thinking back to when I was planning the European leg of my travels, this seemed a lot easier because in my head, Europe seems a lot more familiar. I am more aware of how long it takes to get between one city and another, and there's also so many places in Europe that I want to travel to. When it came to being in Indonesia, however, I was a little bit more out on a limb. Now, obviously the extent to which you plan your route purely depends on the type of holiday that you're looking for and the type of traveller that you are. For me, when it came to the European leg of my journey, it was a lot more fast-paced. There was a lot more places that I wanted to fit into a shorter amount of time, so that meant that I planned a little bit more. Whereas for Asia, I feel as though I didn't have as much insight. And after the 10 days to Bali, I was happy to leave a little bit more of a blank space. The primary reason for that being I was hoping that there would be other people on the tour in a similar situation to myself that would maybe use the tour as a starting point and then want to travel further, and that worked out pretty well. I also had the assistance of the True Travels guide to help with booking up these different bits and bobs as well. So considering Europe is the route that I planned a little bit more, let's talk through that in a bit more detail. So my start point for my trip in Europe was Rome. My end point was San Marino. I had two different friends that wanted to go travelling around that time, and it worked out quite well because I was able to spend 10 days with one and 10 days with another, and that filled in my time in Europe pretty perfectly. With the first friend, there had been talk of going to Croatia, so that's the route that we went down. I flew from Rome to Zagreb, and from there we planned a route which perfectly filled our time. With my second friend, rather than spending more time in one specific country, we were keen to do a little bit of city hopping to try and tick off as many places as we could. So we looked at a map and thought of the best way that we could get from point A to B, see the most places and have the most fun. And a website that I have to recommend at this point is Rome to Rio. If you haven't come across Rome to Rio yet, this is about to revolutionise your life. It is like the holy grail of travel. On this website, you can put in a start point and an end point, click search, and it will tell you all of the different ways that you're able to travel from the two places. It will show you travel options by bus, plane, ferry, car share, taxi, anything. And when in the planning stages of your trip, it allows you to see how long it might take to get from one city to another. It allows you to see how much you might expect that to cost. Looking at our route, we didn't really want to spend much more than 5 hours travelling at a time. And so by using Rome to Rio and Google Maps, we were able to plot a couple different points across Europe that we would stop. Rome to Rio is also incredibly useful when you actually begin your travels. The amount of times in Venice that I would go on Rome to Rio to check which boat I had to get on to get from A to B. It shows you metro lines and stops. It is literally just like a one-stop shop for travel, and quite frankly, I think I might be a little bit lost without it. While we're on the topic of travel, I would also just like to point out that during the planning stages, I didn't book any buses or ferries. The only travel that I booked was flights, and the rest I would book closer to the time once you're more aware of your actual movements. So leaving travel behind, let's talk about accommodation. This is perhaps one of the most important things that you need to look into while traveling, because if you don't have a roof over your head, you're going to find yourself in some hot water. My first piece of advice is, before you even look anywhere online, sit down and decide a sort of budget that you are willing to spend when traveling. Now this could differ from place to place depending on how much privacy you want, how long you're going to stay in a certain place, the sort of amenities that you want at each stop. And there also might be times that you just need accommodation fast. So while you have the luxury of time while in the planning phase, take some time to just figure out what sorts of things you're looking for. Obviously, when I went on the cruise with my family, my accommodation was covered. I was staying in a lovely stateroom. When I went to Croatia for my little 10 days there, the two of us were traveling together and we were more focused on staying in nicer places. We were looking for a bit more privacy, and we were also looking to stay in the centre of town. However, on the 10 days city hopping, we were more than happy to cut back on costs, to stay in hostels, and to get a little bit more of that like interrailing vibe. When on the Gals Who Travel / True Travels trip, all of our accommodation was in twin rooms in hotels, and that was organised by the company. And after I said goodbye to the tour group and started travelling myself and one of the other girls that I'd met on said group, we were back to the hostel life. And obviously now I'm having a few days with family in Jakarta, so my accommodation, thankfully, is free. So hopefully with that little run through, you're able to see that accommodation purely matters on what it is that you're looking for, how much you're willing to spend, and the situation that you are in. Now, the recommendations that I have when it comes to planning accommodation for traveling, I'm sure you will have heard of before. The first is Airbnb. This comes in really handy when you've had enough of the socialising and the busy life and you feel as though you just need some quiet time. For me, Airbnb was my best friend on the Croatian leg of my journey and in Bali when I got struck down with Bali belly. It was a time, it wasn't a good time, but Airbnb had my back rather than me needing to roll around in a hostel toilet. Enough said. And my second recommendation, if you are looking for that little bit more fun, lively, cost-effective travel, is Hostelworld. I only came across Hostelworld about 2 years ago, and ever since it has been in my life, it has revolutionised the way that I book accommodation. No matter where you are in the world, if you pop your location into Hostelworld, it comes up with a whole host of incredible hostels. You can filter your results, you can search for hostels on the map feature if you're looking for a hostel in a particular place, and the users of Hostelworld are very good at leaving a review, so you know that what you're booking is legit. Now is also a fantastic time to mention the variety of places that you can find on Hostelworld. It goes without saying that Asia is going to be far more inexpensive than getting a hostel in Europe, but some of the hostels that I've looked at or stayed at while being in Indonesia are insane. There are incredible hostels for like £2 or £3 a night, and I have yet to have a negative experience in a hostel that I've stayed in that I've found on Hostelworld. Now, the final thing that I want to mention before I end this video and risk it getting far too long is activities. Once again, the activities that you do while travelling will depend on a whole host of factors such as where you are, how much money you have at the time, how big a group you are in, even what sorts of things appeal to you that day. When I was on the 10-day True Travels tour in Bali, I didn't need to plan a single thing because our activities were all arranged by True Travels and Gals Who Travel. That meant that paying for it was already organised. We had transport to and from the different activities, and that was incredible. But if you don't book through a tour operator, you're sort of left on your own, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. When travelling Europe, I was often staying in a city, and I also felt that little bit more comfortable just wandering around the streets of Europe by myself. So that meant that I did a little bit less planning in terms of activities that I wanted to do. I was more comfortable walking around and just finding a museum to walk into, or just hopping on the metro for a few stops and getting off and seeing what was around. Compare that to being in Indonesia, however, I felt as though the activities that I was doing required that little bit more planning. I feel as though this is for a number of reasons. Number one, I've never been to Asia before, and so I wasn't as confident in my ability to be able to just find and book on a tour on the day. Number two, I was aware that the language barrier might make booking activities a little bit more difficult. And number three, I was often spending time away from cities. We spent a lot of time in towns and islands, and planning activities there, particularly when it comes to water sports, is something that I feel more comfortable doing in advance. Consider the activities that you think you might like to do in each place. Of course, you can have a little search online. And when it comes to activities when traveling, I think the experts are your fellow travelers. If you're in a hostel, listen to what other people have been doing, listen to what they would recommend. Oftentimes, hostels will have volunteers who stay in the hostel and whose primary role is to make sure that you have a good time. Speak to them, find out what things are available and what things you would like to do. And as my lasting little piece of advice, say yes to things that you might not normally do. Traveling is all about having fun. It's about seeking out new experiences and meeting some incredible people along the way. So if you are watching this video ahead of travels of your own, I wish you the very best of luck. If you have any questions or would like some advice or recommendations from myself, leave your comments down below and I will get back to you. And as I mentioned at the start of this video, if you yourself have been traveling and you have any recommendations that I have not given in this video, please leave them down below as well. So this is where I'm going to finish this video. I feel as though once again I have spoken for Scotland, what's new, and I'm going to need to stop here because I need to pack. Currently looking at a pile of clothes to my right, and head to Japan. I feel as though this marks the start of a different direction for my channel, so if you like these sorts of videos and you're not already subscribed, please do, and if you do, I will see you again very soon with another video. Goodbye!